On today's episode, the big games that will decide the finals race and the draft order, we break down the Brodie Grundy situation and we take a look at some trade targets for Geelong and the Suns. All that and more on today's episode of Zero Hanger TV. All right, so straight into it. We are 4 weeks away from the end of the season. Finals race is still pretty wide open, so we're going to take a look at some games that are going to pretty much decide the finals race. So what are we looking at here?
It's crazy tight, isn't it? So we've kind of highlighted 13 games across the last 4 weeks that are probably going to have a lot of impact on how this shapes up. Just about every game from any club from first all the way to 15th is going to have some say on how the top 8 finishes. But we've kind of looked to highlight a few from the last 4 rounds of the season. And so starting as early as this week, there are some really, really big contests that we're going to get a decent look. It's quite interesting when, we're 20 rounds into the season, we're still trying to wait and see just how some clubs are going to fare this late into the year and get a better understanding. So it's taking this long. I guess that's kind of what we're expecting with how tight things are on the ladder at the moment. So as early as this week, Dogs, Tigers, Saints, Blues, and the Sydney Derby. So GWS first Sydney, all 6 clubs there. No certainties of being in the top 8 by the end of the season. A few of those are actually still on the outside. The Dogs are in. The Saints and Blues both currently sitting inside, and while St Kilda are in 5th, certainly no certainty of finishing in the top 8. I think a lot of people still have them falling out. And then Sydney still intact, but GWS on a club record 7-game winning run. They're one of the form teams of the competition.
Yep.
Move on to round 22. We've got 4 games. So Pies versus Cats. Now Geelong have one of the hardest runs home across the last 4 weeks. I think all 4 of their opponents are currently in the top 8, and they currently sit in 9th spot. So a good run home will pretty much guarantee them a September showing. But they probably have the hardest run of anyone, and that continues with Collingwood next week. They actually have Port Adelaide this week, which would be another tight contest. Now Carlton versus Melbourne. The D's certainly had a big say on where in Carlton's finish home last year before that game against Collingwood, and then they were a heartbreaking loss against the D's for Blues last year. Another one as well in round 22, we have St Kilda versus Richmond, 2 clubs still battling it out for those last few top 8 spots, and then Port Adelaide versus GWS. And the Giants, I think, are going to be one of these clubs that they're playing a few clubs around them. They're already in the top 8, certainly by no guarantee to finish there, but they're playing a lot of clubs that are going to have some sway. So they're a big role player in this run home. Heading over to round 23, GWS, Essendon, and St Kilda, Geelong. So again, between those clubs that are from 5th all the way down to 15th, and with the second last round of the season, some of those games could even be ones where clubs are their last chance, or even could have their finals hopes ruined by then. And then to finish the year, some blockbuster games: Collingwood, Essendon. So the Pies more than likely to have the minor premiership wrapped up by then, but Essendon, God knows where they could be. They've fallen obviously a few more spots this week, and after that loss to Sydney. So all eyes on that one. If the Dons are still a chance, it could be a bit of a repeat of what Collingwood did to Carlton last year. Geelong and the Western Bulldogs, so Geelong back at Keating Park, if they're still in that hunt by then, and the Western Bulldogs as well, that could be one that's decided on the last day of the season. Port Adelaide, Richmond, another one. Port comfortably already in, but they're going to be really pushing to hold on to a top 2 spot. Brisbane and Melbourne right behind them, and Richmond likely still trying to fight their way into the top 8. And then Carlton will play GWS. So 2 clubs, good chance that they've already booked their top 8 spots by then, but if not, that's going to be a really big contest.
Yeah, it's spicy stuff. It's gearing up to be pretty similar to what happened with Carlton last year. Yeah. So let's take a look at now the draft order. So that's leading up to finals. Who's going to make finals? Down the other end of the ladder. So West Coast have notched up their 2nd win of the season. So now we have sort of a race for pick 1. So what are we looking at there?
Yeah, well, it's tight, and it's still going to take some effort for West Coast to hand over pick 1 somehow before the end of the season. There's still a buffer of, I think, 17% between them and North Melbourne. So that I don't see West Coast kind of getting rid of that anytime soon over just results and over just losses. So it takes some doing for North Melbourne to kind of lose that margin across the last month. West Coast, again, will need an upset win. Whether you want to call Sunday's win an upset win, it was certainly huge for them and for Adam Simpson, but it has led to a tighter race for pick 1. just given where both clubs are at and those long losing streaks with West Coast now coming to an end. So they still have Essendon, Fremantle, Western Bulldogs, and Adelaide. So once again, 4 clubs that are have a lot to play for over the last few weeks. Essendon this week you'd think wouldn't be a chance, but it could be their best for an upset. Fremantle, outside of form, were very good on the weekend against Geelong in that derby. It could be a lot on the line for both of those clubs. And how would it be for West Coast to lift off bottom spot, potentially even eliminate their rivals from finals contention? So that would be an interesting one. Obviously, North Melbourne, they're the only other club really that can potentially secure pick 1. Hawthorn, don't really see them moving outside of 16th spot, and then it's really God knows for the next few selections. Melbourne are really going to be hoping that Fremantle can stay as low as they can, given they've got their pick. A few others, GWS have Richmond's pick, so that's another scenario there. And the Western Bulldogs have Brisbane, so I guess the Dogs can really only hope that the Lions fall as low as 4th, which is probably most likely. So a few of those future selections that changed hands last year, a bit to play out there, but just given how tight things are. As we mentioned earlier in the show, a club could easily slip from top 8 to bottom 5.
Yeah, a lot of weird stuff happens at the end of the year. So moving over to the rookie rankings. So the top 4 or so, it's still where they're at, but a couple of new faces in the top 8.
Starting off at the top of the order, Will Ashcroft will hold his spot at number 1, and I think it'll probably be the last week he does so, unless something drastic happens. Harry Sheasel's last few weeks, or probably month, I've seen him probably back at that best form. Dipped down a bit. Ashcroft came up to 1, and I think they'll level enough across a bit of a period. And then, Sheasel's found some great form over the last couple of weeks, while Ashcroft has obviously had his season over. So I'd expect this time next week, Harry Sheasel to be at number 1. And then, Bailey Humphrey, Max Marcolani, those guys have really held those spots in that chasing pack. And I don't really see those two moving any further out. Judd McVie comes up a spot in place of Ruben Jimby, who's obviously had his season brought to a close as well. Hard to see those guys moving any further back. I think Jinby's probably locked into that top 6 or so. And then there is a bit of a gap with this next group. So we had Jasper Fletcher in there last week. Seamus Mitchell was also in 7th last week. Both of those guys coming out. Josh Weddle taking his teammate's spot at 7th. And then on top of that, Elijah Hewitt comes in at 8. I think he's been one that's had the most honourable mentions throughout the year. He's popped up here and there, and now he's deserving of the top 8 spot in our rankings.
Yep. Speaking of honourable mentions, who have we got this week?
Well, Oliver Hollins has been really good, I think, since coming back in his 2 weeks. So he could be one that pops into the top 8. Once I kind of watch, I think would be Tyler Young. Real slow kind of start to his year. Had a decent role to take on and probably struggled through periods. But in the last couple of weeks, he's been really solid in Richmond's backline. Whether he comes into the top 8 remains to be seen, but he's pieced together a pretty strong last month. And then other guys like Luke Nankervis at Adelaide, Anthony Caminiti, they were okay for the weekend and got some nods as well.
All right, so moving now to the Brodie Grundy situation. So as a D's fan, this is pretty hard for me to say objective about this one. So curious to hear your take. So obviously Grundy's been dropped for the past few weeks, and Gawn's just been dominant, especially in the last quarters. So what do you make of this situation?
The weekend certainly didn't work in favour of Brodie Grundy, you'd have to say, from both at AFL level and VFL level. So he played again for Casey, was used mostly in attack for the forward half and didn't really have an impact as a forward. He couldn't record a scoring shot. I think he had a chance, a set shot from about 35 out, and decided to pass it off. So whether that's confidence thing or maybe it was just team first, it did end up in a goal after the ball bounced around a little bit. But from what the Demons want to see as a forward, they probably didn't. The game was on the line. They lost by 1 point to Williamstown, and when it was in the balance, they moved him into the ruck for which was probably a majority of the second half. And he did what exactly you would expect Brodie Grundy can do, and what we've all come to know he can do as a ruckman. So he kept them in that contest, but obviously it wasn't meant to be by the end. There was tough conditions down at Casey, huge winds, real difficult to score, especially for tall forwards. And he's rotating through there with the likes of Ben Brown, Josh Shackey, Matt Jefferson, Will Verrill in the ruck. So it wasn't the easiest game for him, but I don't think he did himself any favours. On top of that, as you mentioned, Max Gawn, his second half was just one of the most dominant performances we've seen, I think, this year. Add in Harrison Petty's 6 goals, Jacob Van Rooyen, continuing to build. So it's going to make it very hard for Brodie Grundy to come into that team as a forward. So I'd be expecting, it's going to be hard to see him playing this year unless they decide to change things up come selection.
Yeah, so what does that mean for Melbourne now? Do we look at trading him, or, with that forward mix sort of starting to take shape? We've still got Fritsch to come in as well. What are the options there?
So I think immediate future, he probably could be a good chance of playing this weekend. They head down to Tasmania. They play North Melbourne. Simon Goodwin kind of said post-game yesterday that they might think about, resting Max Gawn at some point. So whether that means he has a whole game off or whether they bring in some assistance to help him, maybe it is Brodie Grundy just pinch hitting and then Ruck and Max Gawn playing more forward. That's something they could look at. Now, Casey aren't playing this week as well. So if they don't decide to bring in Grundy this week, then that means he's got a whole another week of having to wait outside of the AFL team. And then do they bring him in the week after having a week off? Probably doesn't add up. So they could make that switch. As far as, like you said, do they get rid of him? It'd be a pretty bizarre scenario to see someone of his position. Firstly, it was moving clubs was crazy enough, but to see him potentially spend 1 year at Melbourne and move on, it's a big decision for Melbourne to make. Like, one, obviously for Grundy to make, but he's contracted, and the last thing Melbourne would want to do is pass him off to a potential fellow contender. So, Port Adelaide, one that have been heavily linked. I think the last thing Melbourne would want would be another top 4 side getting only stronger and then paying a portion of his contract. Now, I don't know how that's going to play out with Collingwood still paying, them still paying. So they could be, only paying a little bit for him to be somewhere else if Collingwood is still chipping in and his new club are obviously paying up a portion as well. But you wouldn't want that at Port Adelaide. Sydney are another one that could do with a ruckman. Obviously, a lot of these clubs have missed out on Tom de Koning this year. So if they were hoping to get a ruckman through him, maybe they've got money aside for someone like Grundy. But it's a really interesting scenario for Brodie Grundy across the last few weeks of this season.
Yeah, and then, of course, for the D's fans, that would leave Gawn without as much support if you were to get injured. Like, we don't really have a backup ruckman as well.
Yeah, so Will Verrill was okay against Casey. He wasn't he's a first-year ruckman. You're not really going to be banking on him as early as next year, I would have thought. So if they lose Grundy and they're paying, let's say, $300K with the money left over, they could easily, I think, go and use maybe what they get in the trade for Grundy and move that somewhere else. But like I said, they'd love to have him as a backup ruckman. It's more whether Brodie wants to be a backup ruckman. Yeah, is the big dilemma. So if you can turn into a forward, sure. I haven't seen enough yet though.
Yeah. All right, interesting stuff. Lots to play out. So now we're going to take a look at some trade targets for Geelong.
Yeah, so probably one of the biggest ones would have been Tom de Koning, re-signed now for 2 years. So Cats certainly might circle back when he hits free agency. That'll likely be the case. But for now, what else can they look at? They've been linked to a free agent in Darcy Paris. There's probably another one they could look at in Tom Doedee. So we're looking at local guys from that area that kind of fit Geelong's recent list management program. So Doedee being kind of from that western region, Alex Witherden and Cam Fleeton, 2 guys off contract who have some footy left in their career. Cam Fleeton absolutely has plenty. He just hasn't had a decent look at senior level, and Alex Witherden's a bit of a curious case and how West Coast and what they're going to do with their list this year. And then another one on top of some of those guys that maybe they could look is Matt Crouch. Their midfield's been dominated against over the course of the season, really. They've really struggled. Obviously, have been without Cam Guthrie for some time, but they probably do need a contested ball winner. Is Matt Crouch one that they could look at? Another guy who's from the western regional areas of Victoria and, has been stellar for the Crows across the past 2 weeks, was arguably Adelaide's best in the showdown win. His future certainly unsettled at the moment, off contract, and it's only played 3 games this year, one of them being as a sub against Geelong earlier this season. So he's certainly making a case for a new deal, but whether that's at Adelaide or somewhere else remains to be seen. But maybe Geelong could look at him.
Yep. All right, and we'll also look at some trade targets for Gold Coast. So they're probably one of the more intriguing teams in this off season with a coach coming in as well. So who would they be looking at?
Yeah, so if it is Dimmer, and obviously a lot of signs point to Dimmer, it's kind of interesting if he tries to pull anyone from Richmond. I reckon it wouldn't be the case, to be honest. And some of the guys we're looking for is still more what the list needs and less so how they'll link to Dimmer. But a key defender definitely needed, I think. Support for Sam Collins. Allow Charlie Ballard to be that third intercepting tool and less of a lockdown option, and I think he'd really thrive in that. So finding that middleman for them. So you look at some of the guys who are key defenders, either off contract or seen as gettable. So uncontracted, Asava Radaglia is one. 2 guys that are contracted that are said to be floated as potentially on the move could be Tom Cleary at Port Adelaide Adam Tomlinson at Melbourne. So if they want, just guys who aren't going to be, the best defender in the world, but are certainly going to be a supporting role for two other players who are on the top line at the Suns, then there's some options. James Jordan's been linked to the Suns. Now, he's a free agent this year because he was once delisted, so wouldn't really cost the Suns all too much, at least from a trade package point of view. And then another one, it's a bit left field, but if Bailey Smith is looking elsewhere, and if he does want to kind of get out of that fishbowl setup, then maybe the Gold Coast could be one for him. But yeah, like I said, a bit more left field, that one.
Yeah, Bailey Smith on the Gold Coast would look pretty good though. All right, so moving over to finish up, as always, we're going to take a look at our MVP. So second week in a row, Dacos did not poll. I thought he was going to run away with it there, but and Bont and Taranto also didn't poll this week.
It's close. Two votes separating the top three now. So as you mentioned, no votes for Dacos in that loss to Carlton. Bont tagged out in most of the second half of the match against GWS, so he also stays at 190, I think 196 votes. It's really tight on there, but Christian Petrarca, 10 votes, puts him up to 195. And then, that's 2 votes that separates him and Nick Dacos in first. So really, really tight there. As you mentioned, no votes for Tim Taranto as well. And then, Toby Green, a perfect game. So I think he was one of 7 players to poll a perfect 20-vote game. That puts him right up with Lachie Neale. Jordan Dawson got a few votes, so he's right behind them. But it's really close with 4 rounds to go.
Yep, interesting stuff. All right. Well, that wraps it up for Zero Hanger TV for this week. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Phoenix.
Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can catch all the latest AFL news on zerohanger.com.